Good morning. I'm Howard Husock, Senior Fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and welcome to our discussion event this morning, How to Attract Top Talent to Key Federal Government Jobs. As we stand on the cusp of a possible government shutdown, it's a very topic of the moment as well as of general ongoing interest. Some background. From the outset of the administration, the Trump White House has made clear two aspects of its perspective on the federal government workforce, which totals some 2.3 million employees. First, that the workforce should be pruned and pressured to perform, or as the executive order establishing the Department of Government Efficiency has put it, maximize governmental efficiency and productivity. Second, as per a May 2020 directive from the Office of Personnel Management entitled Reforming the Government Hiring Process, federal agencies have been directed to prioritize recruitment of individuals committed to improving the efficiency of the federal government, passionate about the ideals of our American Republic, and committed to upholding the rule of law and the United States Constitution. As of July 1st, it's very clear we're in a time of upheaval, however, as it regards the federal workforce. According to the Partnership for Public Service, some 148,000 federal employees and counting have left their jobs voluntarily or involuntarily, in part as a result of financial incentives to do so. At the same time, I just checked the federal job site USA Jobs. 300 of the most senior positions in federal agencies are unfilled. These include, just for instance, Executive Director of Information Technology at the Department of Defense, HUD's Director of Office of Disaster Recovery, and the Associate Chief Counsel of the IRS. Americans, it's fair to say, both endorse the idea of an efficient and loyal government, at the same time, one that provides core services, whether it's food inspection or airline safety. Yet as a government shutdown looms tomorrow, the White House has signaled it may use that event as an occasion for additional mass layoffs. So too has the administration signaled its interest in a new category of non-career, non-permanent, so-called Schedule G employees to be named directly by the executive branch. So the question of how to attract and retain top talent in the federal government is very much of the moment. We'll explore today with our distinguished panel core questions raised by what's going on. Is government being redirected toward a new and ultimately effective approach to attracting talent, or is it being dangerously hollowed out? Joining me will be four experts on the federal hiring process to take stock of where we are to assess the impact of what's going on. Rachel Gressler is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. She's specialized in workforce issues, whether it's Social Security, disability insurance, or pensions, but also workforce issues, including federal employee compensation. Before joining Heritage, she was a senior economist on the staff of the Joint Economic Committee of the Congress for 7 years. She has a master's degree in both economics and public policy from Georgetown. Philip K. Howard is the founder of Common Good, a nonpartisan coalition dedicated to simplifying laws so Americans can use common sense in their daily choices. He's the author of a series of important best-selling books, including The Death of Common Sense, The Collapse of the Common Good, Life Without Lawyers, and The Rule of Nobody. His new book, Everyday Freedom, will be published this week, I believe, and will be featured in its own AEI event next week. He's a longtime partner at the law firm Covington and Burling, and is a graduate of the University of Virginia Law School. Peter Morrissey has worked for the Volcker Alliance, which is dedicated to attracting and retaining rising leaders into public service careers, and he's worked to improve systems of hiring and managing people. He was detailed from the Volcker Alliance in 2023 and 24 to the U.S. Office of Management and Budget to support the implementation of the president's management agenda and key federal talent issues. He's been a staff analyst at the Office of Management Analysis and Planning of the New York City Police Department, holds a bachelor's from Fordham, master's of philosophy from the University of Cambridge, and a BS from the University of Chicago's, an MBA, I should say, from the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. And finally, someone with deep, deep experience in the federal government itself. Ron Sanders, he's a 2006 federal fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, a decorated 20-year member of the U.S. government's senior executive service, now president of and CEO of Public of Virtue, an organization dedicated to helping public servants develop smart strategies for their agencies and themselves. As a federal civil servant, Dr. Sanders served as the U.S. intelligence community's first associate director of national intelligence for human capital, where he earned the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. He was associate director of the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, Internal Revenue Services Chief Human Resource Officer, and DoD Director of Civilian Personnel, and founding director of the Defense Civilian Personnel Service. He's really been involved in hiring and attracting talent in the federal government. I'm going to begin with Dr. Sanders, if I might. Ron, assess where we are right now with what's going on and how that will figure in our goal that we're discussing here, attracting and retaining federal talent.
Howard, thanks, and welcome to you and to the rest of our panelists. Let me just say this. There's good news and there's bad news. Where we are, we're where we've been for over a decade, maybe closer to two. Every year, the government goes through this kabuki dance of whether we're going to shut down or not. We may be in an extreme case, and we were talking before we got on air about the odds. The problem, of course, with those odds is that we are in the middle of college recruiting season. That's the bad news. And
why does that matter?
Well, look, what self-respecting college graduate, especially if you're among the elite, the best and brightest, why would you come to work for the federal government and put up with this every year? And it literally is every year. It goes from one extreme to the other, but it is every year. So that's the bad news. Why would the best and brightest come to public service? And let me add to that. So much of what the Trump administration has done, I personally agree with. I'm a conservative Republican by trade, but so much of it has been unnecessary and unnecessarily provocative. You don't need to denigrate the public service.
Be more specific about that, if you would.
Well, you've got the President of the United States and a so far silent Congress basically saying, do whatever you want. We're going to dismantle the public service, the federal public service. We used to have what I'll call whales, people like George Voinovich and Ted Stevens and John Glenn and Daniel Akaka, who would protect the civil service regardless. But those people are all dead. They're gone. We have a few that may quietly and silently try to protect the federal public service, but they don't do it overtly. So we're in the middle of college recruiting season. We've got this shutdown looming. What self-respecting top college graduate is going to come to work for the public service, especially if not only do we have the current hiccup, but we have a longer term, let's dismantle it. That's the bad news. Here's the only good news. So much of the federal government's civilian workforce, including those like my successors who will eventually become leaders in the federal workforce, are outside of Washington. They go to work for their local installations, and they're pretty much oblivious to what goes on inside the Beltway. So my hope is that they'll be there.
Installations, you mean branch offices of agencies?
Their branch offices, and the Trump administration, to its credit, has gone out of its way to move jobs out of Washington into the rest of the country. So again, particularly for entry-level jobs, look, I won't deny that a lot of them are in Washington, but the majority of them anyway, are outside of the Beltway. People go to work for their local installations. They read about what's going on in Washington in the papers, and they still, I think, respond to a help wanted ad for their local installation. So I'm hoping that some of them will come, but my worry is that the overall mood in this country is to denigrate and dismantle the public service, and it didn't need to be that way. There are ways to do this that are legal, that still get the job done. If you want a smaller government, we can get you a smaller government, but this isn't the way to do it.
Rachel, let me turn to you. I'm struck by the language of the OPM May 20th directive, which says it wants to attract people passionate about the ideals of our American Republic, committed to upholding the rule of law in the United States Constitution, and helping to implement the executive branch priorities. Doesn't that call to patriotism potentially encourage a new sort of potential employee who is drawn to that call? What's your thoughts?
I think it does open it up to people who feel like they want to be patriotic and they want to be in these positions that are more respected. And what's in that executive memo, prior to a decade or so ago, that would have just been common sense. Like, why would you not want somebody who is dedicated to the Constitution, to the rule of the law, and to American principles? I mean, any private sector company, they're not going to hire somebody who does not believe in what it is they're doing. You don't have hospitals going out there and saying, we're going to hire Christian Scientists who don't believe in traditional medicine. This is just making sure that the people that you are hiring actually believe in the mission and believe in the founding of the American Republic. And so I think that it's kind of repetitive to even have to say it here. And nevertheless, it is needed because the first Trump administration found that they had people that were not committed to those things and who were instead defying what they wanted to pursue. And so I think it makes sense to include it here. And yes, it could potentially be attracting individuals that wouldn't have otherwise thought they would want to work for the federal government.
And how do you react to Ron's concerns that the move toward a smaller government is creating, in the way it's being done, a chaotic situation that will deter new talent from coming to the federal government?
I think in the interim period that, is certainly, there's some truth to that, because one of the things that people value most about federal government jobs is the security of them. And that is not something that exists in the short term here, but I think that you have to get to a point where you have whatever that smaller workforce is going to be. There will be some job losses in the interim, but once you get to that, if you have a better, more solid foundation and you have, this commitment to efficiency and people feel more pride in the jobs that they're doing and the American public respects them more, then you end up with, a smaller and a better workforce that's more attractive.
Peter, the Volcker Alliance, which is named for the late Fed Chairman Paul Volcker, is dedicated to attracting people to public service. It's been around for a long time. So its current events have not precipitated the founding of the Volcker Alliance. So something was going wrong, if you will. There was some deterrent to public service even before the current administration. Could you detail why that was necessary to establish this initiative?
For sure. Well, I knew, and so appreciate the opportunity to join the conversation. I was the third employee hired at the Volcker Alliance in 2013. My title was office assistant, and so I've held about a dozen different jobs since then, as they move me around seeking a place for my time and talents, such as they are. And so I got to know Chairman Volcker at the start of the organization, and the key set of themes that animated the organization was a concern about esteem for public service in society, the preparation systems for careers of service, and the connectedness to government employers. And kind of at each of those points in the chain, there was significant atrophying that was limiting the ability of governments at all levels, and especially at the federal level.
Atrophying. Be more specific about that.
That the government's ability to attract top performers that had been well understood to be quite robust, and in Chairman Volcker's telling in his youth, had diminished over time, I think in part due to growing creakiness in the federal and other levels of government hiring enterprise, to rapid changes in the nature of the labor market that governments were not able to keep up with. What I'm struck by in terms of the arc of this work is that many of the themes that we are discussing today are present in the 1989 Volcker Commission report, which I skimmed last week for an unrelated purpose. And I think it is striking. The Volcker Commission report was written in the year I was born. And the same set of ideas that we're talking about today, that there is, insufficient esteem for careers of service, significant risk to politicization of the workforce, an inability to have a really robust human capital acquisition and human capital management apparatus, that is able to array the needs of government against the people it needs to do that work. Those themes continue to be very recurrent. So that is what we are animated by as an organization. I'd say we sort of, we're at AEI here, so I'll use some market framing. We are interested in the supply and demand side of this problem. The supply side, where are future leaders in roles of service? Ron gave a great invocation of kind of their place in the labor market. Learning about opportunities in governmental service at all levels. How are they framing up those opportunities relative to other things they could be doing with their talents in a labor marketplace? And how are governments positioning themselves as employers? And how, for instance, does the federal government position itself as an employer? And I would affiliate myself with Ron's view here that the federal government's employer profile is significantly eroded for very many people in ways that I think are going to wash out over and above those who might be newly motivated over the course of the last year.
In other words, people are not going to want to work for the federal government.
I would share Ron's view that for a lot of talented people, especially in roles this government, including the Trump administration, have identified as very high need roles, nurses and cybersecurity professionals and accountants and auditors, roles that are not principally ideological in their work, but absolutely imperative to the maintenance of our society. I think a growing politicization paired with deep instability, paired with the quite explicit language around the ambition to traumatize, that's the term of the OMB director, not me, the workforce, all add up in the direction of a diminished and less competitive profile. And I would share the view we should use private sector analogs here, which is that I think most private enterprises would not position themselves in the way that has unfolded over the course of the last few months. Though I would concur, many of these challenges are longer standing than just since January. And I'm an advocate of robust reform around them.
Well, Phil Howard, it's convenient to look at the immediate decisions and actions of this administration as deterrents to working for government. But you've written for many years about how legislation and how it's implemented in effect deters effective action by government employees, that one might not want to work for government because of the character of government as it's evolved. Can you elaborate on that? Have I got that right? We're not hearing you. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I have a new book out called Saving Can Do, in which I argue that we can't actually repair the current system. We need to replace it. And I used to have conversations with Mr. Volcker about this. I think that what's happened to civil service, it has become incredibly unattractive for new employees for a variety of reasons. I think it's a symptom of an overall broken operating system. The first is over-bureaucratization. You get into a job, and who wants to spend your life pushing paper, right? So Paul Light had written about how there are like 11 layers of authority between how decisions get made. It's just certainly most ambitious people don't want that job. They want to go into government to make a difference and to feel pride that they've actually done something, not that they've complied with kind of like rats in a maze, some elaborate set of rules and protocols. So, and they experience this over bureaucratization in every aspect of their job, starting with getting the job. It takes months and lots of procedures, and again, much has been written about this. And the second problem with public service, which I'd written a lot about, is the need for, and this is true with any organization, the need for mutual trust, that the people around you are doing their jobs and they have the same obligations and the same standards and values. And so before Donald Trump got elected, I had written extensively about the need for the president to take back control of the civil service and to get rid of people who obviously don't perform, who aren't following, the legitimate orders of the executive branch. There's this phrase, I think it goes, "We be wig, we'll be here when you're gone," where public employees would kind of slow walk executive orders that they don't agree with. So that requires a more robust sense of executive authority. But the goal is mutual trust, the trust that people are doing their jobs. And so right now the needle's gone from paralysis, zero accountability and minor responsibility, to the other extreme, which is seemingly arbitrary firings by DOGE, people without regard to quality, just to get rid of people. It's like I'm not sure what the logic was. So we have no mutual trust because no one is holding poor performers accountable, to no mutual trust because you have arbitrary dictates from the White House. So if you were trying to run an organization that's well functioning, you would be aspiring to a system of mutual trust where people feel if they do their jobs. And by the way, doing your jobs is not simply obeying whatever the White House says. Doing your job involves complying with the law. Civil servants have dual obligations here. So there needs to be some mechanism to reinstill a sense of honor and dignity and mutual trust, which is what Paul Volcker wrote about in the '89 report and also in the 2001 report that he did. And so the good news is we're in a period of disruption. So
that's the good news.
Yeah, that's the good news. We're in a period of disruption, so we can take the broken system and remake it. The bad news is that nobody is coming up with a vision, there's no one in power, of what remaking a good system looks like.
Well, remaking is a very provocative phrase, and the White House has talked about Schedule G, to have many more employees named by the president and accountable directly to the executive branch. It's kind of a non-civil service approach. And we've heard concern about the politicization of the branch. I think from the White House point of view, they've encountered a politicized civil service, and they want to say, if it's going to be politicized, we want it to be our politics. What are your thoughts about Schedule G, Rachel?
Yeah, so Schedule D, or otherwise known as these new career/policy positions, which has been a proposal not yet finalized. This addresses a very small portion of the workforce. It's estimated maybe about 50,000 employees that will be determined to be in these career/policy positions that are influencing policy. And I think this was driven in large part by the first Trump administration seeing how individuals in these career civil service positions were defying orders, refusing to do their jobs, actively going against what the administration was pursuing. And so needing to have an avenue, as Philip noted there's just an utter lack of accountability in the federal government. Federal employees are one-third likely to be fired as their private sector counterparts. The lowest rating that is ever published on the Federal Employees Viewpoint survey, so low that the Biden administration actually eliminated the question, is, I believe that poor performers are dealt with in my unit. The reality there is, 80% of federal managers say they have managed a poorly performing employee, but only 8% of them have ever tried to do anything about it. And of those 8% who try to do anything about it, 80% are unsuccessful, and they're not allowed to have any disciplinary action come out of it. And so when federal employees feel like they are empowered to do whatever they want without any consequence, because they can't be fired because the process is so lengthy and burdensome that no manager ever wants to even take it on because they can't do their job at the same time, that's when you have a problem. And so this career schedule policy would just allow for these positions that are actively influencing policy, people who might refuse to carry out these policies. It's allowing them to not be subject to the traditional civil service protections, but essentially be at-will employees. And I think that makes a lot of sense. We've seen this done in other state and local governments, and it has not had the negative outcomes. These are still not political positions. And this new order does state you do not have to pledge loyalty to the president. It is not political. You cannot be fired for a political reason, but you can be fired for not doing your job.
Ron, do you accept the idea that we're not talking, nobody has said the phrase deep state or administrative state, but it's been implied that there are, people dragging their feet within the government and waiting till the administration changed and they came into government with their own priorities and they want to stick to those. Do you accept that idea that we should be concerned about that?
In part, look, I'll be the first to admit I went to work at OPM. I was the senior career person at OPM. I went to
Oh, so
work for a
personnel management.
Republican director of OPM, Kay Coles James. She came in with this notion of a deep state and very quickly realized so much of this, as Howard has said, is just plain bureaucratic ineptitude. There's no great grand conspiracy. Look, I worked in the intelligence community. If there was ever a deep state, it would exist there. It does not. It's just ineptitude. But as Rachel has suggested, you can't get rid of federal employees. They are overprotected. And in my view, we ought to be looking at a middle ground, one that says you can still serve the public in a dignified way, but you can also be held accountable. Part of the issue is the controversy over this notion of being at will. At will means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Everything from you can be fired tomorrow to you're still entitled to know why you're being fired. You just can't spend years contesting it. And I'm part of a smaller group of a cabal, C-A-B-A-L, that's actually trying to find a middle ground that says you can hold federal employees accountable. You can get rid of them when they're performing poorly. You can deal with that federal employee viewpoint survey response that has now been eliminated that says too many federal employees look at their coworkers and see ineptitude. You can still get rid of them, but you don't need to get rid of them with we can do that without any cause whatsoever. The sort of classic notion of at will. So I do think we should find a middle course that treats the civil service, the federal civil service, with dignity, even when we have to let people go. We can let them go with due process. They can't contest it for years and years. And I'm speaking now as a management advocate for years and years of tenure. So we can't let them appeal basically the paper process, but we can hold them accountable. And let me just add as a quick footnote, Peter, I'm glad you acknowledged this. I was going to say something. The Volcker Commission, this is a problem that's been going on for a long time. The Volcker Commission, the original Volcker Commission, actually funded my dissertation in 1989. And the reason the Volcker Commission was created in 1989 was something called the, quote, quiet crisis, unquote, that failed to attract the best and brightest to federal and public service. My dissertation found that to be true. And you could take the date out of my dissertation and add it and substitute today's date, and you would find the same thing to be true. Too many kids don't believe working for the federal government makes a difference. It can, but it doesn't today, and we need to fix that. I would agree with what Rachel and Peter and Howard and you and others have said.
Phil, you used a very provocative phrase. We can't reform it, we have to replace it. Ron has said some kind of middle ground, which involves making it easier to dismiss people. Rachel talked about making more people at-will employees, which means you can be dismissed pretty quickly and easily, and maybe have a non-career path into government service. Maybe you're working for a few years and not thinking of it as your career. Is that what replace looks like to you?
Yeah, I think replace is eliminating the compliance-based state. I actually reject the idea of due process for accountability. How do you prove who tries hard or who cooperates or who's smart or who has good judgment? You can't prove any of these things. That's why no one's accountable. I believe, and I've written an article for the Yale Law Journal on this, I believe that various provisions of the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, including the disciplinary provisions, violate the president's prerogatives under Article 2, and he should repudiate them. I think that would be a much more powerful reform than Schedule G, because it would apply up and down the line. But because you can't run an organization without mutual trust, you have to have a mechanism in there to prevent that people will trust. And so I propose sort of remaking the Civil Service Commission to be a speed bump against arbitrary firings and terminations but not based on legal proof, but based on independent judgment. And so the Lloyd-La-Follette Act of 1912 basically reaffirmed that the president had authority over civil servants. Could terminate them and such, provided, however, that the civil service agency, or whatever it was called then, had authority to review firings to make sure they weren't for political or improper motives. So there was a speed bump there that prevented that was created in order to have some measure of trust by people working in the government, that they wouldn't be treated arbitrarily. And so that's what I think a much simplified hiring, much simplified accountability mechanism would, and going to the point everybody's made, giving people real responsibility. That's where Doge failed. They thought the government was bad because they had too many people. Government's bad because the people in it don't have the authority to do their jobs. It's just red tape everywhere.
So I'll just point out that Phil Howard just proposed a process in which lawyers would not be involved, and he is himself a very successful attorney, but he's also written a book called The Rule of Lawyers, which takes the point of view that we are too ruled by lawyer, and he's written a book called The Death of Common Sense, that we're overly litigious. So he's a lawyer, but he's being consistent. That's my point, Phil.
Oh, thank God for that.
So Peter, these are pretty explosive ideas that under Article 2, consistent with the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act, which also created the Senior Executive Service, in which Ron Sanders served, that it might be okay for the president to be quite more involved in hiring and firing. Is that going to attract or deter people? Is it consistent with the Volcker Alliance's mission, do you think?
I think the very important, I am not an administrative lawyer, so drawing the precise line, the precise lines, though I would generally concur with the sort of middle ground notion of enhanced accountability paired with esteem and mutual trust. I would say the important caveat that Philip pointed to, which is that in an environment in which the executive has substantially more discretionary authority on hiring and firing, only if that comes along with turning loose qualified professionals to advance the missions they are hired to advance, and doing so in a way that builds esteem rather than diminishes esteem, is likely to lead to a more constructive set of rhythms here. I think
you just used the phrase turning loose. What does that mean?
I will affiliate myself with Phil's description here of a lot of roles in federal service that should, in principle, be very enticing to upwardly mobile professionals, are less enticing than they would be because they are constrained by the capital B bureaucratic elements of very significant levels of approvals and buy-in for nearly every sort of decision.
Let's get specific here. What kind of roles, what kind of jobs should people be drawn to that they're deterred from now, and how can that potentially affect, our experience as Americans?
I think, for instance, people who manage large customer service oriented organizations. There are federal managers who manage 4 or 5 or 6 or 100 or 1,000 people who face outward to serve Americans in customer service oriented roles, say claims specialists at the VA, for instance, are significantly constrained by the warren of a highly bureaucratic apparatus, and potentially by uninformed or arbitrary decisions from political actors above them that do not buy into the esteem of getting their perspective on how a given operational decision should be made. The reason I'm really drawn to the private sector analog that Rachel points to is also because there are multiple paths into federal service. We deal with early career professionals a lot. Much of that work is education. This is the sort of role that exists that you could prefer or that you could consider if you have XYZ interest. I think a future state federal civil service that is more nimble in the way that we have been envisioning here should also be open to people moving laterally from other sorts of organizations, from the private sector, from the nonprofit sector, from other levels of government. And what folks from other levels of government, when they move laterally into federal service, observe, and I would be curious if other panelists concur with this, is that if you move from a similar role in, say, a large private sector company where you manage many hundreds of frontline employees into federal role, you have significantly less latitude of operation and decision making. And that is unappealing. And I think if one of the aims here that I would share, I think, with everyone across the spectrum here, is to push the aperture wider and create a situation where more Americans of more different backgrounds can find ways to serve their country in federal service, and I would say so too at other levels of government, then we need to have a set of roles that are able to both operate with a degree of autonomy and be held to account in the way we're talking about. I think the practices of the last year, the Doge notion was principally focused on the latter of those two considerations. I think a proper way of engaging would engage with both. I see Philip has his hand up.
All right, Phil, but I want to get to Ron too, but go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to give an example. I've done a lot on infrastructure permitting. These processes can go on for a decade or longer. It's just getting approval, bringing in all the Native American tribes, doing a study of historic buildings, whatever. The way the job ought to work is that environmental officials ought to have the authority to make judgments about what are the important issues in an environmental review, not study everything that can be conceived of that might, be affected. They ought to be able to use their judgment. Subject, they can't just do it arbitrarily. There's a court there somewhere, but use their judgment about what's important. And then the environmental review should be 100 pages, not 3,000 pages or 5,000 pages. They should take 6 months, not 6 years. And then when the environmental review process is done after 6 months, and there's a couple of public hearings, not scores of public hearings, the environmental official ought to have the authority to say, in my judgment, it's the benefits of the transmission line are worth the harms of building it through a pristine forest. That's not a legal question. That's a political value judgment, and should have the authority to make that judgment, and subject to the approval of some politically accountable official at the White House or somewhere else. That's it. That job becomes an important job. That the person coming into that job is important.
You just said something in passing that seems very important. Subject to the approval of a politically appointed official at the White House, right? So
Right.
You don't want career people, bureaucrats, making what you call political decisions without political oversight.
Yes, for especially for, I'd say, important issues. There are a lot of things like worker safety issues where you're not going to have politically appointed people overseeing some judgment about an unsafe condition in a factory. But when you're talking about major infrastructure approvals, yes, there should be that affect communities and regions and such. There should be review by a politically accountable person, and the job of the person coming in to be that environmental official all of a sudden becomes a really important job, where their judgment at every stage of the process, how much to review, whether the review is any good, and the ultimate value judgment of whether to give the permit or not is the job of an important person in this society. Even if it's subject to a politically accountable person, it's still the job of an important person. Right now, those jobs are process jobs.
Rachel, are you okay with that? In fact, Phil is giving more power to, I'll just, use a little hyperbole, unelected bureaucrats. Are you okay with that?
Well, I think that he's ultimately saying there is a check on that through the political system, and the president is still exercising his Article 2 executive authority. And so I think as long as there's that check in place, absolutely, like one of the big things that doesn't attract the best and brightest to the government is that lack of ability to be able to carry out the job. Nobody wants to be a high level executive and come in and then just be, hamstrung at every stage of the process. But I will add to that yes, and I think that the ability to be doing something that's meaningful is the number one issue for a lot of these individuals. But there's also the compensation. And while the federal government as a whole overcompensates federal employees, that's highly skewed. And so we actually undercompensate the highest level federal employees. A lot of that is, the pay is already lower on the highest end. It's higher on the lower level. But yes, the pay is slightly lower. But the big thing is that the benefits package, I think there needs to be some more flexibility there. And if we talk about wanting to be able to attract somebody who might just come in for 5 years to help with a particular process, maybe modernizing an IT system or something, and you want to be able to get that individual in, and yet almost 20% of their salary is going to be tied up in a pension system that they might never vest in. I think that we need to holistically look at the way that we compensate federal employees, and it has to be modernized to change along the lines of the same way that the private sector has changed. And that'll require Congress.
Peter, are you okay with that? In effect, what Rachel's saying in a more broad way is we should be recruiting short-termers. We shouldn't think necessarily of government as a career, a lifetime career, that we should be looking for people who have specific skill sets who may come in just for a short period of time. Or should that be just contracted out?
I didn't understand Rachel's comment to be to the exclusion of career roles. I am supportive of a greater degree of flexibility on pathways into service than the status quo across most measures, subject to the important sort of trade-off constraints we're talking about here. I would be very comfortable with a hiring and retention and compensation system that was oriented towards comparatively shorter careers of service, so that you could weave governmental service into a variety of different ways to structure a career. One way we think about this at Volcker is that, and this is with respect to early career talent, but I think it's true generally, we have a set of programs focused on folks who have put their hand up and said, I am interested in public service. I want to work in government because I have a do-gooder ethos. I have a particular commitment to working in a public enterprise, and to think about how our university partners can help channel them into places of appropriate interest. We also have a line of work focused on showcasing the opportunities in government for people who have career trajectories. And they're thinking in terms of disciplines. I want to be an accountant. I want to be a research scientist. I want to be an economist, etc. And showcasing that government, which employs every conceivable discipline, is also a path for them. So I am very comfortable with that progression. I do think I'm certainly comfortable with more flexibility on the compensation side as part of that. I think a key consideration is that surfacing government's technical needs in a thoughtful, strategic, human capital oriented way. We need the following abilities in this approximate quantity to meet mission is upstream of many of these conversations that we have. I think the ability to do that sort of strategic human capital planning is quite variable across the federal apparatus, and it would be good if it were consistently stronger. And I think the ability to do that planning is probably going to be reliant on an excellent core of long-term career civil servants with a robust understanding of where the government's assets and liabilities, strengths, and deficiencies are. So I think adding some short-termers to the mix, I think bringing in excellent, especially change management leadership in highly competitive fields like the one you referenced with technology transformation, all to the good as part of a more blended workforce than we have now. I would generally not endorse significantly greater contracting. My hypothesis will be that one of the tail consequences of DOGE will be a larger, costlier government more reliant on contractors.
We can pick that theme up, but we've heard various references to what it's like to work for the private sector, what it's like to work for the government, for the public sector. Ron, you went from a long public sector career to Booz Allen, where you had a very responsible position. That's a private company. What was the difference like for you?
Well, others have talked about this, Howard. It's about accountability. It was easier to bring contractors on and get rid of them from the private sector than it was to do the same thing with civil servants, particularly career civil servants. They're harder to hire and harder to fire. Now, that's not to say they don't have a role. They do, but in my view, having contractors in the mix, and there's a fine line here between the Booz Allen type of contractor or Accenture or Deloitte or whatever, and a federal, quote, contractor, unquote, like a reemployed annuitant who could be let go more or less at will with appropriate reasoning, but can be brought on much more quickly and let go much more quickly than their career civil service counterpart. So one of the things that attracted me to Booz Allen was that flexibility. Now, having said all of that, and everyone here has talked about the ideal world, and the ideal world would be wonderful, but it's much easier said than done, because that political official, for example, that Phil describes, that's a wonderful job, but what happens if that person is venal? What if they're greedy? And James Madison, way back in the Federalist Papers, said one way to counteract venality was to have alternative and opposing factions. So I worry that all we're doing here is talking about upping the ante and creating a superstructure of civil service jobs that are attractive to young people, but are still potentially bureaucratized, just like everything else. They're still subject to corruption. And to me, we need to step back, take a look at what the Supreme Court has said in its series of decisions around bureaucratic authority. And they've basically said, look, bureaucrats can only do what the law authorizes them to do. Then that dumps it in the lap of Congress. And Congress, which has so far remained too silent from my view, needs to decide on a case by case by case basis just how much authority to give bureaucrats. And for those that they give a lot of authority to, turn them loose. I agree with that. We did that in the IRS when Congress wanted 17,000 IRS customer service representatives to treat taxpayers like customers, which is hard to do when you got to just say, no, here's what the tax code says. I'll credit Charles Rosati, the commissioner at the time, who said, no, but we can teach them how to solve problems in an interest-based way so that we could look at individual circumstances, weigh them against the collective, that is in the case of the IRS, the Internal Revenue Code, and come up with a happy medium that was within the discretion of an individual customer service rep and an IRS employee and an individual taxpayer to come up with. That
Phil.
could be replicated in the IRS, Social Security, FEMA, a whole bunch of other places. But right now, as others have said, bureaucrats sort of default to the less risky view of, let me just follow what the rules say. And the rules are bureaucratized.
So Ron has said kind of two things there. One is customer service facing bureaucrats should be able to have some discretion, but he's also used the C word here for the first time, corruption, right? And corruption and fear of corruption has driven discretion down, hasn't it, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, there are two complementary bad motivations here. One is the general paranoia about corruption, which is not completely unfounded. I'm working with a corruption expert called Linda Miller now on a bunch of potential reforms. And the second is the desire of bureaucrats to avoid being held accountable or taking responsibility. So red tape, if I followed the rules, who can blame me, sort of thing. So you have a system where the outside wants a lot of red tape because they think it stops corruption, and the inside wants a lot of red tape because it keeps them from taking responsibility. So we get this paralytic government where it doesn't do anything.
But you need a leader, Phil, that says it's okay to exercise some, not completely total discretion, but it's okay to exercise some discretion. You need leaders to do that, and this administration isn't doing that.
Well, okay, I agree with that completely, but I want to make the point. Studies of corruption say that the best
Speak up a little bit, Phil.
Studies of corruption say that the best way to prevent corruption is to give identifiable officials presumptive authority to make decisions. You can have someone oversee them. That's fine. I'm all for that. Checks and balances. But you have to locate the responsibility to negotiate the contract or whatever it is, or make the decision in a person so you can shine the spotlight on them. And sunlight is the greatest disincentive. Whereas bureaucracy, you can hide in all the procedures, and corruption can thrive because there are 20 different decision makers. There are no decision makers. So in this new book I have, Saving Can Do, I have a section, an essay on infrastructure talking about not just permitting, but procurement and how inefficient public procurement is. I mean, we're talking about wasting 50 cents on the dollar, in many situations. And the way to avoid that is to give back authority with an oversight. I mean, I'm with Ron. You've got to have oversight on any public money. You can't just let people spend them, give money to their friends, right? So you've got to give oversight. But process doesn't create a good contract. Human judgment and negotiation creates a good contract. And so my view on money and corruption, everything else, is we have to, that too requires rehumanizing human agency, re-empowering human agency across the board with checks and balances, with political accountability, as Rachel said. And especially like in stuff like defense procurement, where we really need to amp up I spent yesterday morning with Elliot Cohen, it's a defense expert, about our incapacity as a country to keep up with munitions manufacture. We've got to get going. We can't go through a 5-year process.
Or AI, all of those things. Howard, let me sort of bring this back to where we started. Because look, at the end of the day, I'll use the term that Phil used. We need to replace the civil service system. It was written for the 50s, that is the 1950s, last century. It was written to constrain the power of bureaucrats when, as Phil has suggested, we maybe need to unleash them. We need to replace the system, reinvent the system, reform. I don't care what R word you use, but we need to do it. And the problem is Congress is as afraid as bureaucrats to do so. Now, I would argue that this administration, with all of its faults and all of its warts, and it has plenty, they may have it right, because as a person who spent decades trying to change the civil service system, you can't do it incrementally. There are too many opposing forces. So it may take something like a government shutdown and reductions in force. Let me just add, because I've talked to senior administration officials over the last couple of days. The reason you've got OMB saying tie your reduction in force plans to shutdown plans is because agencies haven't given OPM or OMB their RIF plans. Even though they could, they haven't. Why? Because bureaucrats are hiding. And so I think you're left with sort of the perfect storm. We need a blue ribbon commission of people who are not afraid to use the replace or transform word. It's a new word, but to replace the civil service system with something built for today and tomorrow, not something built for yesterday. And that way we can recruit the best and brightest. They'll come to work for the federal civil service. They'll do the jobs that Phil has described. And they may move on. That's okay by me, because people like me are probably dinosaurs. I've worked for almost 40 years in government, but I don't think my son and his successors are going to do that. So moving in and out is fine. We need a passport that lets them do that. And I think at the end of the day, though, all under the heading of we need to replace the system in a way that that takes the recruitment of the best and brightest into account, because we want the best and brightest, and we're not getting them today. End of sermon.
We solicited sermons here, Ron. That was the whole idea. Just want to point out for our audience that we're going to come up on our Q&A period, and if you have a question, you can send it to hadars.zv@aei.org. That's hadar.zevi, hadar.zv@aei, American Enterprise Institute.org, hadar.zevi@aei.org, and I will be looking for your questions. There's an established political science literature about how it takes crisis to create important change. And Rahm Emanuel famously says, don't let a good crisis go to waste. What would a crisis in federal employment and performance look like that might lead to wholesale change or discipline of the system? Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Yeah,
Okay,
I'd
Ron,
like to say, I don't think civil service is the kind of issue.
speak up again.
Can-
You're just a little too soft.
I don't think civil service is the kind of issue that motivates public, outrage or something. It's sort of secondary in the public mind. So I think the reform of civil service has to go along with a bigger reform vision of making, government work or avoiding waste or such. But I do think, listening to all of you this morning, that what's needed is not for Congress to take leadership. It's for a group of people like us with different institutions and maybe different political viewpoints to actually come up with a specific proposal, as if we were the Blue Ribbon Commission, and actually come up with a Blue Ribbon Commission report that, if Volker were here, he could lead, that says, why don't we replace it with this? And we've worked for the last 6 months, Heritage and AEI and the Volker Commission, et cetera, we've been talking about this. This is a framework for a new public service that we think would attract good people and instill mutual trust in the people when they get here. And this is what a new framework should look like, and we should abandon the old one.
Look, Phil, we've been there, done that. There are dozens of commissions that have said that. There are technical experts in one echo chamber or the other that have said that. At some point, as Rachel has suggested, Congress needs to take over and log rolling will prevail. But that's okay as long as the end goal is to reform the system. And I agree with you. People don't get upset about civil service systems. They do get upset if there's no FEMA claims adjuster there in hurricane season or post-hurricane, or as a Social Security pensioner, there's nobody in the Social Security office, or as a taxpayer, there's nobody at the other end of the line in IRS. And it's going to take that, and we're either there or close to it. And maybe it'll take a government shutdown to make people realize that the federal civil service does something important, agency by agency, mission by mission. It does something important. And maybe then there are people like Jim Lankford and others who will literally come out of the closet
Senator from
and say,
Oklahoma.
we need to, yes, who say we need to replace the system with something that is far more modern and far more forward-looking than today. And it may include a hybrid definition of at will so that employees can be held accountable. There are all sorts of things, but at some point, Congress needs to take over. They need to repeal Title V or replace Title V or
Title V is
transform
what?
Title V.
Remind us what Title V is.
Title V is the law that contains most, if not all, of the civil service rules under a one-size-fits-all government is one monolithic employer model. And it needs to be replaced.
Right.
So,
The one thing I
notice what
disagree,
Ron
I
has
just
just
wanted-
said. Wait a minute. Notice what Ron has just said, that there could be a crisis, not about the civil service hiring process, but about government performance. That if planes start crashing, and they have, if listeria outbreaks keep happening, and they have, if FEMA disaster responders aren't there, and they've not been, that might kick off a demand for a more accountable government. Peter, you're nodding.
Yeah, I very strongly agree with that. I think the boulder up the hill of trying to make the shape and structure and feel of the federal bureaucracy a first order political issue has been tried and will not succeed. I tend to think people are likely to appreciate the importance of this system only in their demonstrated absence. And I think just to throw some numbers about this, the administration hopes that it will have 300,000 fewer federal employees by the end of the year. Today is a propitious day. The wave of folks who took the DRP, the Deferred Resignation Program, officially conclude their service today. Many of them have been being paid to not work for the last 4 months. And there are something like 154,000 of them who will be likely to depart. These gaps are emerging. I tend to be of the view that we are in the beginning stages of the sort of crisis Ron has described, maybe nearer the middle stages. And I want to observe an important fact about the composition of this. The group of folks, we've talked a lot about accountability of poor performers. One of the administration's principal vehicles thus far have been voluntary departures, try and reduce headcount via any means necessary. There is a very important compositional effect implication of that. The people likeliest to walk out the door first are the people with the most non-federal alternatives. We are adversely selecting for the people with the strongest networks and the most marketable skills by creating a workplace that was already had some very real limitations on how appealing it was to be there, and making it more miserable still. So I think it's not just a numbers game. Perhaps through clever recomposition, we could accomplish all the same job jar tasks with 300,000 fewer individuals. I think the individuals headed for the exits really punch far above their weight, given the way they have been treated over the last 6 to 9 months, and we're going to begin to feel their absence more and more acutely.
Does that
Peter,
make
I
sense
would
to you,
concur
Tom?
with that. And we've been there, done that. Look, at the end of the day, I had to stand up in front of over 300,000 defense workers and say, we've won the Cold War. You've won the Cold War. Thank you for helping us do that. Goodbye. Here's your pink slip. We lost over 350,000 jobs, civilian jobs in DOD, and more than that on the military side, on the uniform side. And we did the same thing in reinventing government. We did it with a smiley face. We did it in a kinder, gentler way. But we lost 350,000 people off the federal rolls during reinventing government. They happened to be in overhead positions and procurement positions and financial management positions, and we're paying the price. We paid the price in DOD. We paid the price in reinventing government. At the end of the day, we'll survive. We just need to make sure that the system that we bring new people, bring their replacements in on, it is up to the task. And right now, it is not.
If I could just note real quick here
ahead.
on that, the reality of those who have left, I agree that yes, they're the ones who have the most options are the ones who have left, but that's, a consequence of the burdensome civil service protections that exist today and the lack of authority to do it any other way. The president didn't have any options to say, let's just find the efficiencies and eliminate the jobs that you no longer need. And so instead, they had to go about it through a buyout offer, as well as, those who didn't have the protections yet, those who were still temporary, non-tenured, getting rid of them first, because that's what the civil service law said. And on top of that, you have a lot of union contracts that included additional limits and who could be fired, the procedures that had to take place. And so that has to be part of a comprehensive reform, is to, when you have a reduction in force, allow it to happen based on the agency's needs and on the services provided to taxpayers. It shouldn't just be based on these protections that are put in place.
So Howard, let me just add, to Rachel's point, the fact of the matter, however, is that the number of employees who have left they're, for the most part, they're voluntary. And contrary to what Rachel said, this administration had the power to say to somebody who wanted to leave, no, your skill is too important. You will stay. They had the authority to do that. They didn't take it. And I've talked to folks in the administration who were surprised to find that under Article 2, they did have the authority to say, this is the size and shape of the federal workforce we want. And here's how we're going to get it. And for some of you who want to leave voluntarily, because as Peter has said, you had the most marketable skills, tough, you're not going. They had the authority to do that. They didn't take it. Frankly, they didn't know they had that authority. And I think if the better way to do this would have been to have OMB say, here are your final staffing targets. Here's the skill mix we want to end up with. We don't want 300,000 people off the rolls here. We want them off the rolls here. And if they don't leave, we'll get rid of them through reduction in force. OMB never said that. They blew the whistle. They said everybody out of the pool. And again, I won't bore folks with war stories, but as director of civilian personnel in DOD, when we won the Cold War, I had to go before Bill Perry, who later became Secretary of Defense, and say, we can blow the whistle and say everybody out of the pool if it's a numbers game, but we will pay the price with skills imbalances because, as Peter has said, the best ones will leave. He said, okay, that's fine. We are in a numbers game. And we were. That's what Congress said. I don't know whether we're in a numbers game now. That's for somebody else to determine. But there are ways to do this without dismantling and denigrating the civil service. We could get to a much smaller federal workforce without all of the pain and suffering, or we'll get to that smaller federal workforce in crisis when We're looking for FEMA claims adjusters post-hurricane, or Social Security claims adjusters when we retire, et cetera, when those crises, plural, occur. But in the meantime, we could decide, here's what we want. The problem, of course, is that OMB doesn't want to say that, because to say that means there are gaps between supply and demand, and there are crises in individual agency missions. Again, end of sermon, sorry.
Phil, I see you're leaning in, and I want to hear what you have to say. I also want to ask you, because Rachel raised for the first time the question of government unions and how they could get in the way of accountability. And you've written a lot about public unions, and you're a bit of a skeptic, I think it's fair to say.
Right. So, and I used to have this conversation with Mr. Volker. So I said, what are you going to do about the union? He said, I'm just going to reason with them. I said, no, they're never going to reason with you. They're interested in no accountability. You have to beat them. One way or another, you have to beat them. He said, no, we're going to reason with them, and nothing happened. So my view of the story of no reforms from all these different commissions that Ron mentioned is that the most powerful interest group that makes every reform initiative dead on arrival is the unions. And I've made the argument, I'm doing a workshop with a bunch of leading scholars this weekend in Washington on the constitutionality of public union controls, basically, and we've got a draft complaint, so we're in midstream in building these arguments. You can't delegate governing authority to a private body. It's a basic constitutional principle. And I think the Trump administration is bold enough in their view of Article 2 to make that argument. I think they should disavow provisions of the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, especially the disciplinary procedures. They should disavow, as they've done, collective bargaining over how government works, which they've done substantially, and that's already in the courts and such. And against that backdrop, I think there might be an opening for a new proposal for how civil service works, because now you don't have the big elephant in the room, the unions, basically saying no. And you come up with an alternative vision that people think makes sense, that will attract good people. And we've never had that situation in our lifetime. And
so you say,
can I just,
please go ahead.
I just wanted to add there, I know that a lot of people are defensive of federal employees having access to unions, but a lot don't realize that federal employees are not even allowed to bargain over the things that private sector unions bargain over. They can't bargain over their pay and their benefits. So federal employees unions' bread and butter is defending bad actors so that they cannot be disciplined or removed for the things that they do. And that moving forward, we just need to get out of this structure where the unions are in control of things and they just prevent any changes from happening, even if they are going to improve the situation, make things better for other federal workers. Nobody wants to be in a situation where they can't count on their fellow employees, or they have to do two jobs because the person sitting next to them isn't willing to do theirs.
the constitutional,
again, I'll go back to
constitutional responsibility.
One at a time. Let me hear from Ron. Go ahead.
all of that. What we don't have, and I think what Phil and Rachel and others are pining for, are the whales like Ted Stevens and Daniel Akaka and George Voinovich, who really cared about the federal civil service, unions notwithstanding. They weren't slaves to the unions. Now, there are legislators today that are. They'll do whatever the unions tell them. That's not a good thing. We had a group of legislators in the House and Senate, Tom Davis, Frank Wolf were on the House side, who cared about the structure and the pay and the tenure of civil servants. It was an outmoded, obsolete view, but it was relevant at the time. We don't have them anymore. The ones we have are silent because they've been censured, because they've gone too far. What this president needs to do is say, it's okay, we need to reform, replace, transform the system, and we want a Republican point of view in that transformation, and it's okay, Langford and others, to speak your mind. Don't be silent about it. Don't operate in the shadows talking to Ron Sanders, and they do. They need to be overt about it, And we need to replace the current system with one that walks and chews gum at the same time. You can have a system in which unions don't necessarily defend bad actors, but still give employees a voice.
Peter, are
can
you
walk
okay?
and chew gum at the same time.
We're ganging up on the unions here. I want to see what you have to say about that.
Well, I was not in Philip and Mr. Volker's conversations because I'm suspecting they happened when I was about 5. I would say I think I'm probably closest to Ron's sort of holistic view of this, which is that the principal thing for me is concern over the enterprise as a whole. And I think some of the attacks on unions have been principally a vehicle for the attacks on the enterprise as a whole. And that's where I think I would have some concern with some of the present approaches. I would also note that some of the administration's specific union-oriented moves have intentionally exempted unions with whom the administration is sympathetic. You know, the VA, the executive order, for instance, starting with invalidating the collective bargaining agreements with VA explicitly exempted the VA's law enforcement unions. And there is a carve out in the broader executive order on labor management relations that carve out that it exempt some of the unions with which this administration has sort of a more sympathetic viewpoint, which I think sort of points in the direction of this being as much a vehicle for a desire to diminish the apparatus on the whole as it is to engage in thoughtful reform.
Phil, you were leaning in. We can't hear you. You're muted. You're muted.
The origin story of public employment unions is not that they were needed. They wanted political power. They wanted to do it to preserve jobs and, become important figures in the political firmament. There was never any story, as in the private sector, of abuse of people in factories or that sort of thing. And so, as Rachel pointed out, they don't even, in the federal government, they don't even negotiate over wages. It's all about how the agency is run. Well, why constitutional responsibility of the executive? And they're the ones accountable to the public for how the agencies run. And so unions, I think, have become not 100% destructive forces in our democratic, but let's say 90% destructive forces. I really think that taking on the unions is a vital piece of getting any reform done. They have to no longer have a seat at the table, because as long as they have the seat at the table, we're going to have some version of what led us to now a kind of indiscriminate, kind of no civil service at all, right? We don't have any civil service protection. We don't have a merit system right now. We have kind of indiscriminate firings by DOEs and such. So what you want is a system where it's controlled, and it's controlled for quality and virtue, and you have checks and balances to prevent corruption. But
if I can just give one example here on the union side and how I would argue they are illegally binding the hands of the executive right before President Trump was inaugurated, after he had won the election, but hadn't yet been inaugurated, the Social Security Administration's union and others, but this one in particular, signed a new contract, and it struck out the authority of the incoming deputy assistants at this SSA to decide certain things. Among them was scratching that out and saying that 98% of SSA employees had a right to telework. Well, how do you service tens of millions of seniors who want to come into an office and need to meet with somebody in person if only 2% of your workforce can ever be required to come in any day? And so it's things like this where the unions just get in the way of actually allowing federal employees to serve the taxpayers well.
So I'll date myself, Rachel. I grew up at a time when unions were actually a force for good, an anti-bureaucratic force who would say to managers like me at the bargaining table, what you're proposing is dumb. This is a more streamlined way to do it. Now that's morphed, but I still think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can have unions at the table in a different sort of way. They're unions that aren't there to establish more bureaucratic procedures and that aren't there to defend bad actors, but who are there as a force for good, and more importantly, as a voice of the rank and file, because contrary to what Phil suggests, there are lots of abused federal employees. They're abused in different ways. They're not in sweatshops, but they're the government equivalent. So I think you can give unions a voice, and as a practical matter, you're going to have to anyway. But at the end of the day, we still need a group of legislators, bipartisan legislators in the House and Senate, who are going to say, here's the new system that we need. And there's going to be some log rolling. But at the end of the day, they're going to have to replace the current system with one that is far more modern. You can't do it incrementally, even though OPM is trying. And that will allow us to recruit the best and brightest, on campuses, where today it's far more difficult to do that, particularly in light of what's going on around us.
Just one last chance for our audience. Hadar, HADAR.ZEEVI@AEI.org if you have a question. I have one here. Is there a pending Supreme Court decision that would limit the discretion of federal civil servants? Do you know anything about that, Phil? Can't hear you again. You're muted.
Sorry. The major questions doctrine is a Supreme Court doctrine that says that agencies can't make decisions that are major questions that haven't been legislated, that Congress has to do that. But there are no Supreme Court rulings of which I'm aware that that limit the scope of a public employee's authority beyond, sort of, you can't shut down the Defense Department because you decide you want to do that if you're a public employee. But that would be a major question. But and the president probably can't do it either. But but in general, there is very little. The Supreme Court rulings on employees are about political accountability, not about the scope of authority.
So Howard, your reader may want to look at the Supreme Court's decision in Roper. There's a companion case that I'm not aware of, but
How do you
to
spell that?
piggyback,
How do you spell that, Ron?
ROPER.
Okay.
And I'll piggyback on what Phil said. It limits Congress, but it also limits what Congress can authorize in terms of the bureaucracy, in terms of things like rulemaking. And the Supreme Court has said rulemaking can only be authorized by the Congress, and its limits can also be constrained by Congress. But at the end of the day, it is Congress, and Congress can't do what we used to call weasel word something, and basically by default defer authority to the bureaucracy like EPA and DOL and others to set rules that they hadn't legislated.
Right,
So
but
I
you're
do
talking
think
about,
that,
but you're talking about rules. I'm talking about, a judgment about the scope of environmental review. That's not a rule. I'm talking about whether to give the permit. That's not a rule. These are executory decisions by public officials that affect how government works, that are not rulemaking is a delegated law. And there's a lot of Supreme Court precedent on that, but I'm not aware of Supreme Court precedent about the scope of employees' authority to make decisions in particular cases, as long as they're within the framework of their legal authority.
well, you've given permitting as an example, and I think that's a good one. An official, whether it's a civil servant or an appointed official or an elected one, and we have all three in this country, they can make a decision on the permit, but they have to cite the law in doing that. Whether whether they have to cite either the law or a rule. They don't just get to decide. And maybe they should just get to decide. That's another matter. But in my view, they have to cite something in adjudicating a permit. And they don't operate in a vacuum. And I think that's what the Supreme Court said in Roper.
All right, I'm going to wind up here with a forced lightning round question, and that's going to be this. If you could do one thing, one change that would do two things, make it easier to recruit, but also improve the performance of government, what might that one thing be? I'm going to give people 10 seconds to think. 9, 8, 7, 6. Okay. Peter, you get to go first.
Sure.
Lucky you.
Sure. Thank you. I would reverse and then expand the administrative decisions around on-ramps for high-flyer early career talent. I think it has been exceptionally destructive.
Translate that for me.
I think it has been exceptionally destructive that the administration got rid of the PMF program, got rid of most of the United States.
President, you got to de-jargonize for me.
The Presidential Management Fellowship, a high flyer generalist talent program, most of the United States Digital Corps, which was set up to recruit high flyer early career digital talent, and then sort of other related programs like GSA's 18F, the U.S. Digital Service, which was the U.S. Doge service in a clever lexiconical turn, the Defense Digital Agency. I think getting rid of a variety of on-ramps for very high flyer talent in the name of the deep state was a poor decision. I would reverse that decision and then consider ways to expand those programs to provide a surge of really top flight talent, some early career, some mid-career, that could help tackle some of these very sticky issues and be a lever that we could use for broader expansion and a sort of spotlight for reform. That'd be my first step.
Rachel?
Well, I mean, big picture, and this is not just a one item thing, but I think that it all comes down to efficiency. If you want people to be willing and to want to work for the government, and if you want the government to work better for taxpayers, it has to be more efficient. And you have to have accountability and you have to have the right incentives. But I don't know how you get that in the federal government because it does not have a bottom line the same way the private sector does. So if you want a more practical recommendation, I would say comprehensively transform the compensation system for federal employees so that it's more aligned to the private sector.
So pay the people whose skills you need the most, pay them more. Okay. Phil?
I think we need to change the
Speak up again.
We need to change the public debate from policy, which arguments, deregulation, regulation, that sort of thing, to the need to completely reboot the operating systems of government, starting with civil service, cut red tape everywhere, shine the spotlight on humans who have responsibility, give people the authority that make a difference in government. That requires a completely new operating system that's not based on compliance with law, that's based on responsibility for results. And law is an outer framework of authority with checks and balances. It's not an instruction manual. And right now, governing is an instruction manual. And so, so nothing much gets done.
Spoken as an attorney, I should add. Ron, you get the last word. How can we make things better just one way?
Just one way. And with all due respect to my fellow panelists, they've provided you means to an end. Here's the end. The president in a cabinet meeting or some other forum needs to say it is a calling to serve. It is okay to come to work for the federal government. You will be doing great things. You will be doing the public a service. You may be constrained. You don't know better than your citizens because we live in a democracy, but it is okay to do this. It is more than okay. It is something we want. With that in my hands, I could go to a college campus and say to the best and brightest, see, we need you. Right now, that's not clear. The president needs to make it clear that we need the best and brightest. They need to come serve, whether they serve for 35 years or 3 years, they need to come serve. And it's an honorable calling and an honorable profession, not one that you should dismantle. End of sermon.
All right, I'm going to extend my thanks to Rachel Gressler, Phil Howard, Peter Morrissey, Ron Sanders, for a deep discussion about a pressing issue. How can we make government work better and be accountable? Thank you very much for joining us.